All right, welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah, glad to be back.
Last time we were talking about the Edict of Reform, and then we went into the first Ottoman Constitution.
Right, 1876.
Yeah, so much to say. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments down below if you have anything to add to that discussion.
Yeah, please chime in.
All right, so let's jump right into the next page of our source material. 1909 Constitutional Amendments. What a year, huh?
1909, yeah. A lot going on. Big year for the Ottoman Empire. We see some really interesting developments here, particularly in terms of what we might call fundamental rights and freedoms.
Yeah, so we're seeing new regulations regarding personal security.
Exactly. I mean, one of the key ones here is the prohibition of illegal arrest.
Right. Article 10, no more illegal arrests.
Huge.
And then the Sultan can no longer exile anybody.
Right, under Article 113, that's gone. So you're really starting to see, I think, a solidification of personal security.
Yeah, and it's a shift away from arbitrary rule and towards a system that's, based in law, right?
Exactly. It's all about establishing clear legal protections.
And then we have a ban on press censorship.
That's a big one. Freedom of expression starting to take root here.
Yeah, huge. And confidentiality of communication. That's another one that's still, extremely relevant today.
Absolutely. The idea that your private communications are protected, it's a cornerstone of individual liberty.
And then they added the rights to assembly and to establish associations.
That's right, Article 120. So you can see the beginnings of a more open, participatory kind of society being envisioned here.
Yeah, definitely. So now let's look at the legislative body.
Okay, so interesting thing here. No structural changes to the legislative body itself. It's still the same bicameral setup, the Chamber of Notables, and the Chamber of Deputies.
So the makeup stayed the same, but how they operated, I think, is really where we see some changes, right?
Right. The real changes are in the process, in the power dynamics. So one of the big things is that now members of both chambers can propose laws without the Sultan's permission.
Yeah. That's big because before it seemed like the Sultan had a lot of control over what even got considered, right?
Right. And not only that, but they also got rid of this requirement to have proposed laws reviewed by the Council of State first.
Yeah. That must have made the legislative process so much more efficient, right?
Oh, absolutely. Streamlined things considerably.
Yeah.
Before the Council of State, which is essentially this body of advisors to the Sultan, they had a lot of say early on, but now it's more directly in the hands of the legislators.
Interesting. Okay. And so the Sultan also sees his veto power changed.
Yes. Huge change there. It goes from an absolute veto, where he could just completely nix anything, to what's called a suspensive veto.
So what exactly does that mean? So he can suspend it, but what happens?
So basically, he can veto a law, but if the General Assembly, both chambers together, pass it again with a 2/3 majority, then his veto is overridden.
Oh, wow. So it's not just a rubber stamp anymore. The legislature really has some power here.
Exactly. It's a major check on the Sultan's authority. And I think this really reflects the growing sentiment within the empire at the time. There was this desire for more representative government, less autocracy.
Absolutely. And the Sultan also sees his power to dissolve the Chamber of Deputies limited pretty severely.
Right. Our source says it becomes nearly unusable. So still technically there, but it's just not a practical option anymore.
And then regarding international treaties, like if the Sultan wanted to, make a treaty with another country, he still had the general authority to do that.
Right. He remained the figurehead, the representative of the state on the international stage.
But there are some limitations here, right?
Right. Some big ones. Treaties concerning peace, commerce, any kind of territorial changes, the rights of Ottoman subjects, anything involving state expenditure. All of that now had to be approved by the General Assembly.
Wow. That's a significant portion of, foreign policy and finance now under legislative control.
Absolutely. It's a major shift in the balance of power.
Okay, so let's dive into the changes to the executive body now. So we're moving beyond the legislature.
Right. And a lot of this is focused on the Council of Ministers, which, as you recall, is kind of like the cabinet, the main advisors to the Sultan.
Right, the folks who are actually running the government on a day-to-day basis.
Exactly. So under the 1876 Constitution, the Sultan had complete control over this council. He appointed everyone, dismissed everyone, the whole 9 yards.
So a very centralized system.
Very much so. But the 1909 amendments really shake things up. The Sultan now can only directly appoint the Grand Vizier and the Sheikhul Islam.
Okay, so who are those people?
So the Grand Vizier, think of them as the Prime Minister, the head of the government, and the Sheikhul Islam, they're the highest religious authority in the empire.
Okay, so those two positions stay under the Sultan's direct control.
Right. But all the other ministers, they're now selected by the Grand Vizier and then just formally approved by the Sultan.
Interesting. So it gives the Grand Vizier more power, more autonomy in shaping the government.
Precisely. And there's another really important change here. The accountability of the Council of Ministers. It shifts. Before, they were only answerable to the Sultan.
Right. He could hire and fire them at will.
Exactly. But now they become responsible to the Chamber of Deputies, both collectively and individually.
So the elected representatives now have a say in how the government is run.
That's right. And they can hold ministers accountable for their actions. You can really see a move towards a more parliamentary system here. In fact, our source uses the term Mesruti Monarşi, which is basically their way of saying constitutional monarchy.
So the Sultan is still there, still the head of state, but his power is much more limited.
Exactly. He's bound by the Constitution, and the government is answerable to the legislature.
So a huge turning point. And this all leads us to the 1921 Constitution.
Right. This is where things get really interesting. We move from reforming the existing system to creating a whole new one.
And this constitution was adopted in January 1921, just 9 months after the opening of the Grand National Assembly of Turkey. So this is a brand new assembly, a brand new constitution.
Brand new everything. And what's fascinating is that, according to our source, there was no special procedure for adopting this constitution.
Really? So they just passed it like any other law?
That's what it seems like. No special quorum, no nothing. But it's still clearly a constitution in its substance, in its impact.
Okay, so tell me, what makes this 1921 Constitution so different?
Well, it's a pretty short document, only 23 articles and one additional article, but it packs a punch.
So it's short, but powerful.
Very much so. The most significant thing, I think, is the very first article. It states, "Sovereignty belongs unconditionally to the nation."
Wow. That is a complete rejection of the Ottoman system where sovereignty resided in the Sultan.
Totally. This is a radical shift. It's saying the power comes from the people, not from a monarch, and this principle underpins the whole structure of the Constitution.
So what kind of government does it set up?
It establishes what's called an assembly government system. So all the power is concentrated in the assembly. There's no separate president.
Interesting. So the Speaker of the Assembly kind of acts as the head of state.
In a way, yes. They also lead the Council of Executive Delegates, which is kind of like the executive branch.
And what about the courts?
Interestingly, there's no specific regulation of the judicial body in this constitution. That comes later.
Okay. So a lot of focus on the assembly, and then another key feature is this emphasis on decentralization.
Right. Centralization is very limited, only in exceptional circumstances. The general rule is decentralization.
Okay, so given this focus on national sovereignty and the power of the assembly, what happens to the Sultanate?
Well, it essentially becomes obsolete. There's no room for a sultan in this system. And indeed, in late 1922, the Sultanate is abolished.
So just like that, the Ottoman dynasty comes to an end.
Well, not quite. It's a bit more complicated than that. They
Right.
separate the Sultanate from the Caliphate.
Right, so the Sultan is gone, but the Caliphate, the religious leadership of the Muslim world, that remains, at least for now.
Yes. And the decision of who would be the Caliph, that's left to the Grand National Assembly.
Okay, so we're entering a whole new era.
Mm.
And then on top of all this change, you have the first Lausanne negotiations, which are trying to settle the aftermath of World War I, and those hit a snag.
Right. Things are very unstable. The country is in transition. The war has just ended. The negotiations are stalling. There's a need for strong leadership.
And this is where Mustafa Kemal Pasha comes in.
Exactly. He sees the need for a more unified political front. So in December 1922, he establishes the People's Party.
Okay, so a new political party emerges.
And then he pushes for new elections, which are held in April 1923.
A new assembly is elected.
And this new assembly, the Second Assembly, they decide to proclaim the Republic.
Wow, huge moment. So they write a whole new constitution?
Actually, no, they just amend the 1921 Constitution.
Really? That's interesting. How do they do that?
They add a very simple sentence to Article 1. The form of government of the Turkish state is a republic.
Just like that. No more monarchy, even in name.
Exactly. And at the same time, they amend Article 11 to create the office of the president.
Ah, so now they have a president.
Yes. And the way the government is formed also changes. The prime minister is now appointed by the president, and the ministers are chosen by the prime minister and approved by the assembly.
Okay, So this is moving away from that pure assembly government system and more towards a parliamentary model, right?
That's right. The assembly still has a lot of power, but the executive branch is becoming more distinct.
So what about the caliphate? You mentioned that it was retained for a while.
Right. And our source points out that there were a couple of main reasons for
Okay,
this.
let's hear them. What were they thinking?
Well, firstly, the political situation within the First Assembly was very complex. There wasn't a clear consensus on abolishing the caliphate right away.
I imagine some people were very attached to the idea.
Absolutely. It was a centuries-old institution, a powerful symbol.
And secondly,
Well, they also had to consider the international implications. The Lausanne negotiations were still ongoing, and they didn't want to alienate the Muslim world.
right, Turkey was trying to find its place in the New World Order.
Exactly. But ultimately, the decision was made. In March 1924, the caliphate was abolished by law.
Law number 431.
And not only that, but the entire Ottoman dynasty was expelled from Turkey.
Wow. A clean break.
Oh,
So the caliphate is gone, the sultanate is gone, the Ottoman dynasty is gone.
yes. But it's important to remember that abolishing the caliphate didn't automatically mean that Turkey became a secular state.
Right, it was still a very religious society.
And in fact, the same amendment that proclaimed the republic also added a clause to Article 2, stating that the religion of the Turkish state is Islam.
Okay, so they got rid of the caliphate, but they still maintained Islam as the state religion.
Precisely. It's a complex and fascinating period of history.
Absolutely. Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. Thank you so much for walking us through all of this.
My pleasure. I always enjoy these conversations.
And to all of you listening, thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to like and subscribe. And as you think about everything we've discussed, here's a question for you. Knowing that the caliphate was retained for a short period after the abolition of the sultanate, how do you think that might have shaped the early years of the Turkish Republic? Something to ponder. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.